to lead us to the politics of this. It's from Will Bennett.
Thanks, Tony. For the past 10 years, politics has overpowered policy in climate change and energy. With the release of this report, we now have a pragmatic and realistic blueprint for the future. Under Dr. Finkel's plan, a clean energy target means coal may play a role, but it is not essential. Of paramount importance is bipartisan support, without which we have no hope of achieving the required investment. Josh, do you feel confident you'll be able to get support within your party, particularly from the backbench, to adopt such a target?
Well, thanks for your question, Will. I think my colleagues, and I've obviously spoken to a lot of them over recent days, understand that business as usual is not an option, and that the problem we need to solve for is a level of regulatory certainty which will incentivise or see new investment. Because we've seen 9 coal-fired power stations close in Australia over the last 5 years, but we haven't seen sufficient generation coming into the mix. And I think what's so important about Dr. Finkel's report is that it does, through the clean energy target, provide a market signal to see further investment. It does, through the stability measures, ensure that we can properly integrate more intermittent sources of power, namely wind and solar, into the system, into the grid, without seeing a repeat of what we saw in South Australia. And it is also consistent with the Paris targets that we signed up to under Tony Abbott of a 26 to 28% reduction by 2030 on our 2005
Now, Josh,
levels.
since you've mentioned Tony Abbott, I mentioned him a moment ago. Is this scheme effectively a tax on coal? Because that's what your former leader says it is.
No, it's not a tax on coal. And what
did you manage to convince him otherwise? Because I know you've spoken to him recently.
I have spoken to him, and it was a very constructive conversation. Tony has... everyone would love to be a fly on the wall for those. But, I mean, what Tony has said today, he set himself 2 criteria, 2 benchmarks for a future mechanism in this space, whether it puts downward pressure on prices and whether it would allow coal to continue. And I think the clean energy target does that. And we have to come back to the trilemma. And we're dealing with affordability, which Rosemary knows all too well through putting consumers first. We're dealing with stability, which Mark knows all too well, coming from the state of South Australia. And we're dealing with Paris commitments, which Amanda knows well. So we've got this challenge, and you can't please everybody, but what we do need to do is better than we've done in the past. And I don't think Australia has been well served by the argy-bargy of politics in this area, because we've seen higher prices, a less stable system, and so now it's time for change.
Josh, what everyone wants to know is what's going to happen when you go into the party room tomorrow and certain prominent figures from the past stand up and say you've put a tax on coal, that you've created a magic pudding system here. I mean, and it won't just be one person, will it?
Well, look, I'm sure there will be a few of my colleagues, and rightly so, who want to know more detail. And having spoken to them, a lot of them have already read Dr. Finkel's report, and, you know, they have got questions for me on various aspects of it.
Are they asking you whether or not this is putting a price on carbon and therefore, as they would see it, a tax on coal?
No, they're wanting to know that the energy mix of the future will serve Australians well in terms of that trilemma, and understandably so. And under Dr. Finkel's model, coal will still continue to play an important part of the energy mix. It does, you know, not all electrons are created equal. It does provide certain stability services that you get from baseload power, and that can be hydro, it can be gas, or it can be coal. And we can't just transition overnight to a new energy mix without making allowances for those differences.
Okay, so one very brief question. You've obviously done a lot of calling around your colleagues. Do you have the numbers, do you think, to carry the day on this issue?
Well, I'm not taking a position, a particular policy to the party room tomorrow. What I'm going to do with my colleagues is take them through the changes that we're seeing in the energy system, what Dr. Finkel himself has described as the most significant in more than a century, and then repeat to them what are the key conclusions of the Finkel review. And out of that will come some discussions, but this process has got a long way to run. We've taken a long time to get here. There are a lot of complications. It's state and federal dynamics, and I hope tomorrow is a step forward.
All right, let's hear from the other panellists. Rosemary, you're here representing consumers effectively. So what do you think consumers think about the way politics has enmeshed these issues over the past decade?
Consumers have been thinking about these issues deeply and carefully. We study consumer sentiment every 6 months through a survey that we do, and what we're hearing from that survey is that there's a real concern that this market, as it is at the moment, is not working in their interests. So people understand that there's something wrong with this market, and I think that most people would see Dr. Finkel's report as an opportunity to reset this market and focus it much more on outcomes for consumers. On the affordability question, consumers are seeing and are going to see significant price rises coming through the wholesale energy market, and that's because we don't have a mechanism in place to bring further supply into the market. Consumers in our survey are understanding that there's a supply issue and something needs to be done about it. Of all the mechanisms and the modelling and the evidence and the discussion that's going on, it seems to us that the clean energy target is the least cost way of changing the generation mix from a current level of around about 13% renewables to, I think, in the order of 40% renewables by 2030. And for that reason, we think it's an idea that really deserves very careful consideration by everybody. Politicians, industry, and it's certainly getting a lot of consideration by consumers.
Okay, Amanda Mackenzie, let's get your perspective from the Climate Council.
Well, as others have said, the lack of climate policy, the lack of any sort of national plan on energy has been driving up emissions, and it's been driving up prices. And this policy is a way forward through that. And whether it's an EIS, a CPRS, an RET, all of the different acronyms we've heard, the ultimate question we need to ask is this going to tackle the climate change crisis that we're facing? And we see that starkly when we look at the Great Barrier Reef, the mass bleaching that's occurred 2 years in a row, the worsening heat waves, hot days doubling in Australia in the last 50 years. And so looking at this report through that lens, it doesn't go far enough. And there's 3 reasons for that. The first is that it doesn't get emissions down as far as they need to go. The second is it should be doing far more on coal. We need to be retiring coal-fired generators. And this report envisages coal-fired generators being part of the mix till 2050, whereas we need to get to net zero emissions by then. And also, we need to get further on renewable energy as the third point. We can do better than 42% in renewables by 2030. It should be well over 50% if we're going to be tracking to the Paris commitments.
Very briefly, do you back the blueprint as a kind of model where the targets can go up and down, it can be used to reach whatever political target is set by the government of the day?
The critical element for us is whether the policy can be ratcheted up over time. So as Josh and his colleagues consider what the legislation would look like if they do in fact adopt the policy, what would be important for us is what is those emission restrictions and is there a ratcheting up mechanism over time?
Okay, I'm just going to quickly go back to our questioner, Will Bennett. I know you originally asked a double-barrel question. You also wanted to know what the Labor Party was up to on this.
Yeah, well, I just think that the key point is getting a policy in place first. And, you know, I'm wary of history repeating itself as what happened in 2009 with Rudd's ETS. And, you know, we'd be in a different situation now if that had gotten through. So I think the important thing is bipartisan support first, and then if Mark is fortunate enough to win government, then he can ratchet that up. But I think it's just getting something in place is more important.
Let's go to Mark Butler.
That's the plan.
Is that the plan? Well, describe it for
Very
us.
perceptive.
Describe it for us.
To get Josh to do all the hard work, then lose and then hand it over.
So you see this something like an emissions trading scheme that you can ratchet up when necessary?
Well, we were asked by a coalition of business groups, some environment groups, ACOS, the ACTU, a couple of days ago to give Dr Finkel's report full and fair consideration, and that's what we've committed to do. So we're studying it carefully, we're going to engage carefully with stakeholders. In due course, we'll engage with the government about this, talk to state governments. What we have said, though, is that even though we had a clear preference for a different type of model, the emissions intensity scheme that Dr Finkel's referred to. We are willing to put that aside, and even though we took it to the election as our policy and talk about a clean energy target framework, if that is the only basis on which we can have some discussions across the aisle with the government, then we are willing to put that aside. We think it is a framework that can work. I think there are still some attractions in the EIS that aren't there, but it is a framework that can work, provided you get the design right and provided it's scalable. Because the really important point Amanda makes is that Dr Finkel was not asked to come up with an appropriate level of emissions reduction in the electricity sector by 2030 or 2050. The government's not asked anyone to do that. It ignored the Climate Change Authority's advice about that. So we're working within the parameters of Tony Abbott's targets that he set internally without independent advice. Now, so long as we can put that aside and say, is this a mechanism that can endure, provided it's scaled up in accordance with independent advice?
Just explain to us briefly. You've looked at it, you've got some glimpse of it, and you know that it can theoretically be scaled up by changing the prices and the target. So how would you do it if you got into government?
Well, we'd take some further advice about this. I mean, we've had the view going back several years from when we were in government that when it comes to emissions reduction targets and a whole lot of the policy mechanisms about implementing, it's important that government get objective expert advice about making sure that we're doing what is necessary to get the emissions down to keep global warming below 2 degrees, to make sure that we're compliant.
Let's say we
with
understand
Paris.
that point.
Yeah.
How would you use the clean energy target to scale up? How would you do it?
Well, we'd have to get advice about what the appropriate contribution by the electricity sector to the economy-wide emissions reduction task was. Now, Dr Finkel has assumed, as was his brief, that the electricity sector would do only its sort of mathematical share of the 28% reduction that is the government's policy. Whether that's really the right thing, given that electricity can drive changes in transport indirectly, changes in industry indirectly, I think is still an open question. But that's not the question we have before us. The question we have before us is whether the clean energy target and some of the other policies that Dr Finkel has proposed are able to be discussed between the government and the opposition, finally to break this impasse that has really been with us for almost a decade now, that is holding back investment and driving up power bills for consumers that Rosemary represents, and for many businesses that employ hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers.
OK, well, can I just ask the Chief Scientist, you designed this scheme. Did you design something that could be scaled up by future governments?
So the answer is yes. I always urge caution, though, in going into something with the anticipation that you're going to change it straight away anyway. The community, all ends of the community, right from generation through to consumers, needs some predictability. So we haven't actually made a numeric recommendation to the government. What we've done is we've modelled the only sensible thing that we can model, and I think a very credible thing to be modelling, which is a trajectory. And it's a big change from where we've been at. Most people are thinking about a target, a 2030 target, and they think about the target in terms of renewables. We're trying to change that discussion from a target to a trajectory out to the future, because if you have a target, then you get there and you say, hey, what next? You might have locked in solutions that you don't want to have for the long term, so you have to have a long-term view. And the other thing is we're trying to shift the focus from renewable energy to emissions. So, Amanda, you mentioned getting out of coal or getting into renewables. We've tried to actually elevate the discussion to the end point, which is the outcomes. If the right mix of existing coal and renewables gives you the emissions reduction trajectory that you want, and we're talking about atmospheric emissions here, not technologies, then that is the best outcome. So governments can choose the slope of that trajectory, and the clean emissions target will adjust itself to deliver the outcome that governments are looking for.
OK,
Can I just
yes,
say,
you can. Yes, briefly.
We could reduce our emissions tomorrow by half if we outsourced all our manufacturing jobs to another country. And this is the key point, is that there's a transition underway, but it has to be carefully considered. Indeed, in the Finkel report, they actually issued a note of caution about how much you reduce your emissions in the electricity sector, because our industry is so cost-sensitive or price-sensitive on this issue. So Mark's team have a 45% emissions reduction target. We have a 26%. They've never modelled the impact of cost of their target on the economy, of the jobs, and you've got the unions, who normally would be the backbone of your party, issuing again their own concerns about why a higher emissions reduction target could cost thousands of jobs.
We're going to come to these issues.
Right.
We've got lots of other questions that we want to get to, and everyone will get a chance to get in on them. You can join this conversation on Twitter and on the Q&A